War II. The government is still using funds to boost education and industries. So by the 1950s, America is the most prosperous civilization in history. Pretty incredible. So we emerged as the leader of the free world. And we supply the free world with all of our goods and military technology to prevent the spread of communism. All right, what we're going to learn about consumerism. We talked a lot about consumerism in the 1920s, but we have the same theme in the 1950s with new technology. The new thing is television. Black and white television, and then it's going to transform into color television. A lot of the big radio broadcasting companies switch over to television, like NBC, ABC, CBS. Those are all radio broadcasting corporations that transfer and get into television. By the 1960s, 47 million Americans have television. Prosperity, we're going to start eradicating diseases that have plagued humanity, like smallpox. We're going to develop vaccines for smallpox, typhoid, polio, yellow fever, many viruses that have plagued us. And we start developing antibiotics to treat bacterial infections. This also leads to prosperity, a healthier society. Americans feel comfortable to start having kids again. They didn't want to have kids during the Great Depression, and they weren't having kids during World War II because most of the men were off fighting and women were working in war factories. So after the war, with this prosperity, people start having families again. It leads to the baby boomers. That's a huge spike in children being born following World War II. Describe the domestic developments. We're going to look at President Eisenhower's administration just a little bit. Advances in medicine, which I just mentioned, and the interstate highway system. We'll look at the automobile, pop culture, and then we get to start the civil rights movement. I've split the civil rights movement up into two units, because I want you to know that it lasts in the 1950s and then in the 1960s. I want to split it up. Then we'll spend a little bit of our class period talking about the civil rights movement. But it's not the first civil rights movement, because I mentioned civil rights a lot in class, all the way back to Booker T. Washington and Du Bois and I.W. Wells. All right, let's get started. It should be a little bit confusing with the vocab on your screen, because I've added more vocab. So you might have to kind of find the vocab within the slides. All right, prosperity and consumerism. People are still leaving the farm. The concept for a lot of Americans of a single family farm has faded because of the expenses of maintaining a large mechanized farm and the widespread availability of education and job training leads to the growth of white collar jobs, suit and tie jobs, suburban living, a college educated workforce. These are new things that emerged in the 1940s and 50s. The suburban ideal of having a house in the suburbs emerges in the 1950s. People start leaving the cities. We talk about people moving to the cities, now they want to live outside the cities, on the outskirts and suburbs. And a lot of this is made possible to World War II veterans through the GI Bill of Rights, which gives them low interest mortgages to buy homes and provides grants so they can go to college to get training. So this is another reason why the 1950s is very prosperous. The veterans of World War II are given a Bill of Rights to provide them with access to training and jobs and housing. So even today, veterans can get low interest mortgages for homes. So we also have this society becoming more homogenous. Everybody wants the same lifestyle, and a lot of it's portrayed on television now with TV shows like Leave It to Beaver and all those sorts of films that show this family that's led by the husband and the expectations that women should leave the workforce and go back to become housewives. A lot of that becomes more popularized in the 1950s. Even though World War II had liberated a lot of women from this type of lifestyle, television kind of starts spreading this American concept of this nucleus domesticated family with a car and a house in the suburbs. All right, these are some of the first suburbs that were built in upstate New York. They bought these home builders, just like you see all around here, bought large tracts of land. They build houses with the same floor plans. And they mass produce these homes. I have a great video I'll show you to let us know how they built these homes. Anyways, this is kind of the beginning of the suburb. I think I have a. I didn't do it. I don't know why I have this slide here though. This was a potato farm. All the farmlands are getting bought up by home developers and converted to suburbs, which we see all over here. People are desperate to sell their farmland because they can sell it for such a high price now. The land is becoming more and more scarce. All right, baby boomers. I think I had them in the earlier slide, but here they are. Following World War II, the increase in births. Americans feel like they can have families, and there's more prosperity. A rise in standard of living, increase in pay, and relatively low inflation. So the median pay in the 1950s was $1,800. What was your average pay for most Americans for the year?
Well, what's the inflation now?
Yeah, so think about inflation between then and now.
I call it what, $50,000, $70,000?
That's less, so $1,800 is less than what most if you work all alone. Typically, hopefully you make a little bit around that or more. Now, talking about that, dollar has inflated.
What a bit.
Dollar has inflated, yes. And a lot of it has to do with a lot of government policies following the Great Depression and something called Keynesian economics. But that's for another day.
Oh, yeah. This one, he can say he's in the office.
Oh, okay. I can't take attendance. Skyward's not even working. So most people that are born in the 1950s, looks like it ends in 1964, are baby boomers. They're all getting into their 60s, early 70s, and they're all going to start retiring and needing more medical care. All right, Dwight D. Eisenhower. So we talk about Dwight D. Eisenhower, we talk about World War II because he led the D-Day invasion. So he's this great American war hero, easily elected president. Truman serves his second term. And Eisenhower easily wins the 1952 presidential election. The advances in medicine and science. This is when the United States starts exploring space, competing against the Soviet Union, who launched Sputnik. Remember, that was a vocab term for the Cold War. The Soviets get Sputnik into space, and Eisenhower says, "Oh no, we need to step up our science in math, education, and public high schools. We need to step up our funding of public education." This is when we start developing huge college research institutes like the University of California, University of Texas. These become huge wings of American research to help get us into space. So we get Alan Shepard's the first American into space. John Glenn's the first American to orbit the Earth. But the problem is the Soviets had done all that before us. So then John F. Kennedy says, well, you know, we're going to get to the moon first. That's when we start. We do the Mercury program, the Gemini program, and then the Apollo program, and we built the Saturn rocket to get us to the moon. That's for our 1960s. Anyways, Eisenhower says, you know what, we probably need roads before we do all this stuff. Back when he was just in the Army still, he traveled across the United States, and it took him, I can't remember how many days it took him. It took him like, I either want to say it was 16 days or 60. But I'd have to look. So he says, you know what? If we're fighting the Soviet Union, what if the Soviets hit us with nuclear weapons on the West Coast? What if they obliterate Los Angeles and Seattle and we need to evacuate the population? We can't evacuate if we don't have highways. And what if New York City or Washington, D.C. is hit with a nuclear weapon? You probably need to evacuate, but if you don't have roads, everyone's going to get stuck and die. So he says, we need an interstate highway system. So that's why we have the interstate highway system, because of Eisenhower. It's the largest, one of the largest engineering projects in American history. Way bigger than the Transcontinental Railroad, way bigger than the Panama Canal. That's why Murfreesboro. I asked my first block, and nobody knows the name of the interstate that cuts through Murfreesboro. It's the interstate. 24. That cuts right through Murfreesboro, goes down to Chattanooga, up to Nashville and beyond. It's all part of the interstate highway system. It hits I-40, which cuts across the country. Even numbered interstates run east to west. Interstates that end with an odd number run north to south. We have all these interstates. Oh, and then we also eradicate polio, which had crippled FDR, with Jonas Salk developing a vaccine for polio, which eventually they put it into a sugar cube, so you could take your vaccine with a sugar cube. There we go, interstate. So now you can drive across the country in 72 hours. They have these competitions. They're illegal.
Highly.
Where people drive across, break the record to get across the country in a car.
What are they called?
I can't remember what they're called. Usually two people.
Cannonballs.
Cannon run.
Cannon, something like that. Something to do with cannons.
Yeah, so two people sit in a car and they fill it up with gas and have gas canisters in it. And one guy sleeps, and one guy drives, and usually they have a spotter up ahead or a bunch of spotters to spot for the police. And they try to get across the country really quick.
24 hours or something like that.
Somebody made the record during the pandemic. I think it's cheating.
No, not really though.
Nobody was out driving. They did the cannonball run across the country.
Oh, they're going.
I don't know what car they're using.
They're using an Audi.
Oh, yeah. I know some of them use Mercedes.
How long does it take them?
It has to go fast, but you also can't consume too much gas. It has to be a fast car, but not. Yeah. Okay, here's the automobiles. So the impact of the automobiles, dramatic. Fleets in suburbs, fast food chains, and hotels. I think these are all those guys' terms. So people don't want to get out of their cars, so that's when you get fast food. And people are traveling across the country, they need places to stay, so you get the hotel industry. You get the rise of America's desire for fossil fuels. Now, even in the 1950s, America was producing 60 to 80% of the world's oil. I always found it fascinating that we became so reliant on the Middle East. We produce even more oil now than we did in the 1950s because of technology like fracking, which is kind of controversial because you pump water down into the ground and or pressurize the ground and force more oil that you otherwise couldn't extract out. But then that water can never be used again. It's forever contaminated. So they're always worried about it contaminating groundwater, drinking water. So we kind of have to keep those people. Sometimes it's like, there we go. We got Ray Kroc, McDonald's, hotels. You know, a lot of films are Psycho. You've seen, is that a Hitchcock film? Has anyone seen Psycho?
Yeah, it's very
I mean, I can't recommend for you to see it. It's really,
yeah.
even for this time, it was incredibly controversial. But that's all takes place because of this fascination with hotels and motels, which arose in the 1950s. You haven't seen Psycho, it's about this crazy dude who runs a motel, he kills people that stay in it. And he thinks that his mom's still alive up in the mansion behind the motel.
Yeah.
But his mom's dead and he keeps her alive like a skeleton. But that was like I think that was made in the 1960s. All right, the beatniks. Not everybody wanted to conform and live in suburbia and have a white-collar job. And a lot of people could never attain that. So they turned against it. They were anti-conformist. Still, I mean, there's lots of different groups today that are anti-conformist. They don't believe in, you know, oh, I want to go to college today. It's just not really practical. It's incredibly expensive. What am I going to get out of it? Maybe I'll go do this, and maybe I'll go do that. I don't want to live the ideal of America, which is having a house and a family. I want to go do something different. Well, the beatniks of the 1950s, they didn't want to conform and live out in suburbia. There are writers and poets who attacked or criticized this lifestyle. And they're kind of like the forefathers of the hippies. Except the hippies are going to be way more radical than the beatniks. Both groups experiment with drugs, alternate lifestyles. The Jack Kerouac book On the Road is considered the Bible of the beatnik generation. You go to college, you might read On the Road, depending on your professor. Okay, and we have music. It's all Tennessee. Tennessee's rich with music history. This is all coming out of Memphis, Tennessee.
Wait, what you just talked about, like
The beatniks?
no, what the people who just like on the like just stayed on like the road, like,
Yeah.
they farmed here, then they went somewhere.
These guys, they just drove around and
Yeah.
across the country and stayed with friends and family and they never wanted to settle down.
I had watched a documentary about that. It's talking about like how minorities or like the poor people, like they were moving to Florida, like they would just keep going around the country, like going around wherever they could find a job, and they would travel in groups like this. Yeah.
So music, Tennessee has lots of musical history. If you're ever lucky enough to go to Memphis, you should go to visit many of these musical museums. Stax Records is a great museum now that you can visit. But anyways, you need to know these 4 musical topics. B.B. King is kind of considered the father of, not really the father of the blues, that's Robert Johnson, but king of the blues. So blues music was African American music that arose out of the Delta region of the United States, which is along the Mississippi River. It's an incredibly poor region of the country, and African Americans saying about, and remember, there's still racism and prejudice and Jim Crow. They sang about their problems and they put it to music with the guitar. And this becomes blues music. And later it's all electrified with electric guitars, and it becomes rock and roll. And all of this emerges in the 1950s, for B.B. King, and then, of course, Elvis Presley. The audiences, white audiences really were looking for somebody, a white musician, to take all of this African-American music and kind of make it their own, and that's how it becomes really popular. And Elvis Presley becomes like the #1 American rock star and celebrity all the way into the 1970s, when he dies at his really interesting mansion called Graceland.
I think that hotel.
But I think that if you go to Memphis, instead of visiting Graceland, I think you should visit Stax Records.
I'll go to Memphis, you should definitely visit that restaurant.
You know, I lived in Memphis for a long time. I moved right when they decided to convert the pyramid into a bath version. I've been to like every museum in Memphis. Of course, if you go to Memphis, you should go to the Civil Rights Museum first.
I never thought that person. I always go find
They're great for wondering.
Every time I listen,
Okay, great. And what do you think?
I like it.
It's a wonderful museum. You ever go? I think Stax and Civil Rights Museum. Yeah, there's a lot of really great
Yeah, I think
things
the
to
only
visit
museum
there.
I've been to is the John Deere Tractor Museum.
That was
That
probably
was a
great.
great museum.
And like, if you go to the Stax Records Museum, there's like a little, thing where you can take a picture of it there and you can just play with props.
I remember, the one thing I remember was this giant gold Cadillac. One of the artists in it.
That was their favorite.
Was it Isaac Hayes? Anyway, all right, so you need to know all this. Of course, then Sun Studios is a tiny little studio. Actually, it still is in operation, where a lot of the early rock and roll artists recorded their music. And these were all put out on record, or they're played on the radio. Let's talk about the Civil Rights Movement. The 1950s is also, even though we've learned a lot about civil rights in this class, but traditionally people teach that this is really the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, but we know that the Civil Rights Movement began way back before the 1950s. This is when it gains enough momentum to become a movement that can cause change. And to understand Brown versus Board of Education, we have to rewind our class all the way back to, I think, August, when we covered Plessy versus Ferguson. That was the Supreme Court case that segregated American society. It legalized segregation with the famous separate but equal clause. So the Supreme Court in the 1890s said that you could have segregation as long as it was equal facilities. So I'll tell you. So here's the NAACP, which we learned about, fought for civil rights for African Americans, and W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the founding members. They realized that separate but equal isn't, we know that it's not, it never actually occurred in Southern society, but you could really see that separate but equal wasn't true in schools. They could look at white schools and black schools, and they knew that black schools were inferior, less funding, poor facilities, less everything, less pay for teachers than their counterparts. So the NAACP mounted a series of Supreme Court cases, that culminate in Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. So Linda Brown, there was a white school a block away from her house, and Topeka told her, the school district said, no, you have to go to the segregated school way over on the other side of town. So they sued the school district in this case, along with several others, are all bundled together into Brown versus Board of Education. The Supreme Court shocked America. A lot of the pressure on the Supreme Court was, look, we're fighting communism, And we're talking about freedom, but American society isn't free and equal. So the Supreme Court says, well, we need to make American society free and equal so that when we're talking to South Korea or wherever our allies are, and we're saying, look, we have a free and equal society, don't turn to communism. And the Soviets loved to use segregation against us. So this is the turning point when the Supreme Court says we need to make society equal, we need to end segregation. So it starts with school, public schools. And it orders all public schools in the United States to begin to desegregate. It's going to take decades. It's not instantaneous. A lot of districts really drag their feet and oppose desegregating. Some school districts don't desegregate until the late 1970s, more than 20 years after Brown reported education. But there's a lot of controversy with desegregation, like schools would desegregate by busing students in from different parts of town. It leads to a lot of conflicts at schools. And I think our first one here is at Clinton High School in Clinton, Tennessee. There was a lot of opposition to desegregation. And people from out of state came in to protest desegregation. Against desegregation. They did not want schools to desegregate. They supported segregation. So in Clinton, Tennessee, there were riots, and the community would rather have their school blown up. They blew up their high school. I'm not saying the whole community decided to blow up high school, but some people that really didn't want the school to desegregate blew it up.
That's what that's the school in Tennessee?
Yeah. They blew it up rather than desegregate. Now, the big case that gained national attention is Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. The governor refused to desegregate. So President Eisenhower says, well, you know what? You have to listen to the Supreme Court. They're the supreme law of the land. So if you're not going to listen to the Supreme Court, then I'm going to use my executive powers, and I'm going to send the military in to escort students to schools to desegregate it.
Did they ever do that for all groups?
No, not for all schools. You might see something like a Little Rock 9. I think she needs to think desegregation. The Clinton 12. So these were the brave students that were selected to go into these schools to desegregate. All right, so Eisenhower says we need to enforce desegregation. All right, let's move on. Rosa Parks. You think about icons of the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks should be up in the top 5. She was a trained civil rights protester. She actually got her training not too far from here on top of Mount Eagle Mountain. If you're going to Chattanooga, there was a school that trained people to protest injustices nonviolently. And so when she was asked to give up her seat on a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama, she refused. And this is the spark that starts off the civil rights movement, the modern day civil rights movement that we're all familiar with when we think about the civil rights movement. So once she refuses to give up her seat and she's arrested, the leaders of African American leaders of Montgomery decided to start a boycott. So they refused to use the buses, and they were some of the primary users of the public buses in Montgomery. So Montgomery is not making any money from their bus system. because of this boycott. So the protesters are trying to hurt the city, which is segregating its public transportation by refusing to ride on it. And then Dr. King, the pastor from Atlanta, he arrives to lead the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasts over a year. And the U.S. Supreme Court orders Montgomery to integrate its bus system, so it's a huge victory for the civil rights movement. So now not only are schools starting to get desegregated, but other aspects of public life. And this will take the civil rights movement forward into the 1960s. When we get to the 1960s, we have a lot of civil rights movement topics to cover. So we have lots of nonviolent protesting, like sit-ins, freedom riders, the Children's March in Birmingham, the voting march in Selma, the March on DC. Of course, once the Vietnam War breaks out, the civil rights movement kind of starts to lose a lot of steam because the Vietnam War starts to take a lot of the headlines away. And a lot of